The Mire House Echoes. The asphalt ribbon dissolved into a gravel track, then into something barely more than a scar across the land, overgrown with stubborn weeds and slick with recent rain. Elias Thorne gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as the old sedan bucked and groaned beneath him. The last vestiges of the afternoon light bled from the sky, taking with it any comforting sense of proximity to civilization. Here, there was only the deepening indigo gloom and the primeval hush of the encroaching wilderness. He had driven for hours, leaving behind the cacophony of the city, a landscape of blaring horns and incessant chatter that had begun to feel like a physical assault on his very being. Elias, a man whose life was meticulously calibrated around sound, had found himself increasingly sensitive to its chaotic manifestations. He sought the inverse, a purity of quiet, a sonic canvas upon which he could articulate the abstract landscapes of his latest, most ambitious project, the capture of silence itself, and the subtle, often terrifying, sounds that dared to puncture it. This, he believed, required absolute isolation. It required Blackwood Mire. The estate, a distant and seldom mentioned inheritance from a great aunt he barely remembered, had always existed as a spectral presence in his family's hushed conversations, a place of forgotten grandeur and whispered misfortune. Now it was his. The instructions for its location had been vague, almost deliberately so, sketching a path to the very edge of the known world. The further he drove, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing in, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and cold, like an ancient rusted key. The trees began to close in, their skeletal branches reaching, clawing at the fading light, forming an archway over the crumbling drive. The silence outside the rattling car was profound, broken only by the rhythmic tick of unseen insects and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk. But even that cry seemed muted, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the expanse. A sudden, inexplicable chill slithered down Elias's spine, a precursor to the true cold that awaited him. He shivered, pulling his worn denim jacket tighter. It wasn't merely the temperature dropping, it felt like a presence, a cold breath on the nape of his neck. Then, through a sudden break in the dense skeletal canopy, it appeared. The Mire House. It was not merely old, it was ancient, a skeletal monument against the bruised twilight sky. Its silhouette was jagged, an intricate drawing of gables and turrets, dormers like hollow eyes staring out from beneath heavy, slatted brows. The stone, once a dignified gray, was now mottled with black lichen and streaks of rust-colored decay weeping down its facade like dried tears. Windows vast and numerous were mostly black voids, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. A few, however, caught the last weak light, glimmering with a brief, unsettling sheen, as if something had just moved within. The gate, a wrought iron monstrosity twisted into grotesque leaf-like patterns, hung half open on a single rusted hinge, groaning softly in the barely perceptible breeze. It looked like the maw of some metallic beast, perpetually exhaling a breath of forgotten time. Elias killed the engine, the sudden quiet of the vehicle a stark contrast to the cacophony of his own heartbeat. The air outside was colder now, a damp, penetrating chill that seeped into his bones. He could feel the weight of the house, a crushing presence, even from this distance. It seemed to inhale the light, pulling the shadows deeper around its foundations. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. The silence of Blackwood Mire was unlike any he had ever encountered. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a distinct, palpable entity. It hummed with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in his ears, a deep drone that felt less like an auditory phenomenon and more like a pressure in his skull. He specialized in capturing such things, the infrasonic whispers of the world, sounds below the threshold of human hearing that could still evoke feelings of dread or awe. But this felt less natural, more deliberate. He pushed the gate, its tortured shriek tearing through the heavy quiet, echoing across the desolate grounds. The sound scraped against his teeth, a raw metallic protest. The drive, once a grand approach, was now a choked path, swallowed by thorny bushes and trees whose branches clawed at the fading sky. He navigated the car slowly, the tires whispering over the carpet of damp leaves and decaying matter. The house grew larger, more imposing with every foot he advanced. The garden, if it could still be called that, was a wild, untamed tangle of thorny roses that had outlived their manicured beds, their skeletal branches reaching like grasping hands. A crumbling stone fountain, its basin filled with stagnant, oily water, stood in the overgrown courtyard, a stone cherub with a broken wing submerged beneath the murky surface, its sightless eyes gazing upward. He parked the car near the front steps, which were themselves fractured and uneven, leading up to a massive oak door. The wood was dark, almost black, scarred by centuries of weather and neglect, adorned with a heavy, ornate knocker shaped like a grimacing gargoyle. Its surface was cold and slick beneath his gloved fingers. He didn't bother with the knocker. He had found the heavy brass key, tarnished and intricate, among his great-aunt's sparse belongings, nestled in a velvet pouch. The lock groaned in protest as he turned the key, a metallic shriek that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the house. With a final, resonant click, the heavy oak door swung inward, not with a creak, but with a deep, drawn-out sigh, as if the house itself was exhaling a breath it had held for decades. A wave of frigid air washed over him, carrying with it a scent that was at once familiar and profoundly unsettling. Dust, mildew, damp stone, and something else, a faint, almost metallic tang, like old blood or rust on ancient iron. He stepped over the threshold, his boots sinking slightly into a thick layer of dust that had accumulated over years, perhaps decades. The light from outside, already dim, seemed to recoil from the interior, swallowed by the cavernous gloom of the entrance hall. His breath plumed in the cold air. The ceiling soared far above, lost in the shadows, and a grand staircase, its banister intricately carved with dark, twisting foliage, swept upward into the darkness. Moonlight, thin and watery, filtered through a tall, arched window at the landing, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced with the slightest shift in the air. The silence inside was different from the outside. It was a pressurized, expectant silence, alive with its own unspoken hum. It felt heavy, laden with unarticulated secrets. Elias pulled a tactical flashlight from his bag, its beam cutting a stark swath through the gloom. Dust motes, disturbed by his entrance, swirled like tiny galaxies in its path. The wallpaper, once perhaps a rich brocade, now hung in peeling strips, revealing older, faded layers beneath, like the unraveling skin of an ancient being. Portraits, their subjects' faces obscured by grime and shadow, stared down from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow him. They were not merely pictures, they were witnesses. He moved slowly, deliberately, his footsteps muffled by the dust. Each step sent a tiny ripple through the oppressive quiet, and he found himself listening, not just for his own sounds, but for an echo, a response, a counter-sound. The house felt vast, empty, yet undeniably full. To his right, a massive parlor, its furniture draped in ghostly white sheets, loomed. The air in there felt even colder, a pocket of concentrated chill. He imagined the shapes beneath the sheets to be bodies, waiting. He resisted the urge to pull them back. To his left, a dining room, its long, polished table reflecting the weak light like a still, dark pool. A single chair lay overturned as if someone had left in a sudden hurry, a detail that snagged at his analytical mind. Was it a previous occupant, a squatter, or something else entirely? Elias decided to set up his primary recording station in the library, a room he had glimpsed in a faded photograph among his great-aunt's papers. It was described as having excellent acoustics, a vague family boast that he now needed to verify. He found it at the far end of the ground floor, past the dining room. Its door, unlike the others, was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness even deeper than the hallway. He pushed the door open fully. The library was a mausoleum of forgotten knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, crammed with leather-bound volumes, their titles obscured by dust and shadow. The air here was thick with the scent of old paper and something else, something metallic again, like static electricity or ozone, faintly acrid. A large, ornate desk stood in the center, littered with what looked like forgotten papers, their edges curled and yellowed. This space, despite its decay, possessed a certain solemn grandeur. Its enclosed nature, the sheer volume of books acting as natural sound dampeners, promised the acoustic isolation he craved. He began the laborious task of unloading his equipment from the car. The heavy cases of microphones, preamps, converters, and cables felt cold against his fingers. He made several trips, the return journey to the car always accompanied by the unsettling sensation of being watched from the house's dark windows. He powered up his field recorder, its small green lights a comforting beacon in the gathering gloom. He set up a pair of omnidirectional condenser microphones, their delicate grids poised to capture the faintest sonic whisper. He connected them to the preamps, then to the recorder, checking levels, calibrating, immersing himself in the familiar ritual of his craft. This was his anchor, his way of imposing order on the chaotic world, and perhaps on the chaotic silence of Blackwood Mire. As darkness fell completely, thick and absolute outside the library windows, the sounds of the house began to shift. The wind, which had been merely a distant sigh, now found purchase in the gaps of the ancient windows, whistling through them with a thin, reedy moan. The old timbers of the house groaned and popped, settling into their nighttime rhythm, a chorus of creaks and subtle shifts that Elias meticulously catalogued in his mind. He knew the difference between a house settling and something else. His training, his obsession, made him acutely aware of every sonic anomaly. He was adjusting the gain on a microphone, his back to the room, when he heard it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a sound so delicate he initially dismissed it as the rustle of his own clothes or the whisper of his breath. But then it came again, clearer this time, a breathy, drawn-out sound, like a sigh exhaled directly into his ear. Not words, not yet, just the undeniable impression of a voice, impossibly close, yet utterly without origin. He froze, every muscle tensing. He slowly turned, scanning the darkened room with his flashlight. The beam cut through the dust-filled air, illuminating empty shelves, the dusty desk, the shrouded furniture. Nothing. He was alone. He tried to rationalize it. The wind, perhaps, funneled through a specific crack in the wall, creating a vocalized effect. His mind, tired from the long drive, playing tricks. He was seeking silence after all, and perhaps his brain was manufacturing sound to fill the void. He even noted it mentally for his project. Subjective auditory hallucination, day 1. He returned to his equipment, a new prickle of unease rippling beneath his professional detachment. He donned his high-fidelity headphones, adjusting the volume, preparing to make his first official recording. The world outside his headphones vanished, replaced by the amplified sounds of the library, the hum of his equipment, the subtle creaks of the floorboards, the distant sigh of the wind. He sat for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting. The silence was immense, a heavy blanket. And then, beneath the hum of his preamps, beneath the barely audible thrum of his own pulse, He heard it again. A distinct, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It was faint, so faint it could have been the drip of water, but it wasn't. It was too precise, too deliberate. It seemed to come from directly above him, from the floor above the library. He knew the house was supposed to be empty. He had seen no signs of recent habitation, no other vehicle. The sound was not heavy like footsteps. It was lighter, almost delicate, like a small, hard object being repeatedly, gently struck against a wooden surface. Tap, tap, tap. His breath hitched. He ripped off his headphones, the sudden return of the room's less amplified sounds jarring. The tapping, though fainter without the headphones, was still there, an insistent, rhythmic punctuation of the oppressive quiet. It wasn't the house settling. It was too regular, too intentional. A profound, unnatural cold seized him, radiating from the floorboards beneath his feet, rising up through his limbs. It wasn't just the air, it felt like a cold that emanated from within the very structure of the house, a chill that carried a palpable dread. He reached for his flashlight, his hand trembling slightly. The rhythmic tapping continued, a steady, measured cadence from the darkness above. It was a sound that defied explanation, a sound that burrowed deep into the quiet chambers of his professional, analytical mind, and began to plant the first chilling seeds of an altogether different kind of project. He was no longer merely observing silence. He was now, undeniably, being observed by it. Tap echoed not just through the house, but through the very bone marrow of Elias Thorne. It was too precise, too measured to be the random settling of an ancient structure. His analytical mind, honed by years of dissecting the nuances of sound, wrestled with the raw, primal fear that now coiled in his gut. He had come here seeking the purest silence, the raw, unadulterated canvas for his art. Instead, the silence was revealing itself to be a meticulously constructed cage, and the tapping, its restless inhabitant. He slowly drew himself upright, the cold radiating from the floorboards now seeming to emanate from within him, a chill that had nothing to do with the external temperature. His flashlight beam, which had been resting on the dusty pages of a forgotten tome, now trembled in his grip as he swept it across the library. The high shelves, the shrouded desk, the dark, unseeing windows, they offered no explanation, only deeper, more impenetrable shadows. The tapping persisted, a relentless, quiet insistence from the floor above. Elias unclipped the smaller, more portable field recorder from his belt, an instinct born of professional habit overriding the rising tide of dread. Even as his hand shook, he pressed record, extending one of the delicate omnidirectional microphones towards the ceiling. The green light pulsed, a silent testament to the recording process, capturing the oppressive quiet, his own ragged breathing, and the steady tap, tap. Tap from above. Upper floor, he whispered into the microphone, his voice a dry rasp in the vast room. Rhythmic tapping, unexplained, source unknown. He listened intently, trying to discern any pattern, any variation in the rhythm. It remained steady, unwavering, a metronome counting out moments of escalating terror. He couldn't stay here, merely recording. His professional curiosity, a dangerous driving force, demanded investigation. He had to locate the source. He had to rationalize it. Steeling himself, Elias moved towards the library door, his boots crunching softly on the accumulated dust. The hallway was even darker now, the last vestiges of twilight having fully surrendered to the night. His flashlight beam became his sole companion, a fragile spear against an ocean of impenetrable black. Each step he took felt like an intrusion, a desecration of the house's profound, ancient slumber. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its dark, polished banister a cold, serpentine presence in the gloom. It rose in a graceful, terrifying curve, disappearing into the absolute darkness of the upper landing. The tapping seemed to grow fractionally louder as he approached, pulling him upward, a siren song of the uncanny. He placed his foot on the first step. The wood groaned, a deep, resonant sigh that seemed to vibrate through the entire structure. The sound was not sharp, not a creak, but a protracted lament, as if the house itself was expressing its displeasure at his ascent. With each subsequent step, the groans deepened, joining a chorus of subtle shifts and protests from the ancient timbers. The air grew colder, heavy and still, pressing in on him. He could almost taste the dust, thick and metallic, on his tongue. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that threatened to drown out the external sounds. He gripped the banister, the smooth, cold wood offering little comfort. The shadows thrown by his flashlight danced on the walls, twisting into grotesque, fleeting forms, faces, grasping hands, skeletal trees. He found himself pausing on each step, straining his ears, not just for the tapping, but for any other sound, any whisper, any shift in the pervasive silence. He felt watched, not by a single entity, but by the very essence of the house itself. Every dark recess, every shadowed corner seemed to hold a pair of unseen eyes, their gaze heavy and cold. As he reached the landing, the tapping became undeniably clearer, emanating from somewhere down the long, cavernous hallway that stretched into absolute blackness. This upper floor felt different from the grand yet accessible ground floor. Here, the air was even colder, prickling his skin with goosebumps, and the silence was more profound, a suffocating absence that swallowed sound whole. He swept his flashlight beam across the landing. More doors, uniform and dark, lined the hallway, each one a potential threshold to another chamber of forgotten lives. The wallpaper up here was even more decrepit, hanging in damp, mold-flecked tatters, revealing glimpses of the lath and plaster beneath. A large, ornate mirror, its silvered surface cloudy with age and grime, hung on the opposite wall, reflecting only the wavering beam of his flashlight and a distorted, fleeting glimpse of his own pale, anxious face. He averted his gaze quickly, a superstitious tremor passing through him. Old mirrors in old houses held too many reflections. The tapping drew him to a door at the far end of the hallway, directly above where the library would have been. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness even deeper than the surrounding gloom. The sound was unmistakable now, closer, more insistent, seemingly originating from within that room. Tap, tap, tap. He paused before the door, his hand hovering over the cold porcelain knob. A faint, almost imperceptible scent drifted from within. Not just dust and decay, but something sweeter, cloying, like dried flowers or forgotten perfume, mingled with that persistent metallic tang. He pushed the door inward slowly, the wood groaning softly on its hinges. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing what appeared to be an old nursery or child's room. The air here was particularly cold, a concentrated pocket of chill that made his breath plume visibly. The room was small, sparse, but filled with an overwhelming sense of abandonment. A small wooden rocking horse, its painted eyes faded and chipped, stood in the center, tilted slightly, as if recently ridden. Its mane and tail, once perhaps bright yarn, were now matted with dust. The tapping was coming from a corner of the room. He advanced cautiously, his boots stirring up clouds of ancient dust. His beam landed on a small wooden stool overturned beside a low, intricately carved crib. And on the floor beside the stool, nestled amongst cobwebs and dust bunnies, was a collection of faded wooden alphabet blocks. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from them. One of the blocks, bearing the letter E, was lying slightly apart from the others, gently rocking against the polished floorboards. As he watched, it tapped once more against its neighbor, an L, then settled into stillness. The rhythmic sound ceased. Elias let out a long, ragged breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Rationalization surged forward, a welcome antidote to the rising panic. A draft, of course, a subtle current of air funneled through a crack in the window or a gap in the floorboards, causing the light block to shift and tap against another. It was old, yes, but explainable. His professional skepticism reasserted itself, albeit weakly. He knelt, picking up the E block. It was surprisingly light, smooth beneath his gloved fingers, imbued with the scent of old wood and something else, something faintly sweet and powdery, like a forgotten child's scent. He examined the window, the floorboards, searching for the source of the draft. There was a faint whistling from a badly sealed pane, but it seemed too weak, too inconsistent to explain the steady, rhythmic cadence he had heard. He placed the block back down, carefully, deliberately, not touching its neighbors. He waited, listened. Nothing. Only the omnipresent, heavy silence of the house, punctuated by the frantic drumming of his own heart. He tried to mimic the draft, blowing gently, then harder at the block. It barely stirred. The explanation felt flimsy, unsatisfying. As he straightened up, his flashlight beam swept across the crib. It was a beautiful piece, dark wood with delicate carvings of sleeping cherubs and trailing vines. But, draped over one of its rails, half hidden by shadow, was a small, faded rag doll. Its button eyes were chipped, its yarn hair matted, and its simple cloth dress was stained with what looked like dried mud or something darker, more ominous. A sudden, sharp cold, distinct from the ambient chill, enveloped him. It felt like a freezing current had passed directly through his body, leaving him numb and breathless. He shivered violently, his teeth chattering. The air around the crib felt dense, heavy, like a physical wall. And then he heard it. It wasn't the tapping, it was far more insidious, more terrifying. A whisper, faint, almost inaudible, directly beside his left ear. Not words, not yet, but a sustained, breathy sigh, like a child murmuring in its sleep or drawing a shuddering breath. His blood ran cold. He spun around, flashlight beam sweeping frantically across the empty room, across the rocking horse, the overturned stool, the alphabet blocks. Nothing. He was alone. Utterly, terribly alone. He stumbled backward, knocking against the doorframe, a dull thud echoing in the oppressive quiet. His professional detachment shattered completely, leaving only raw animal terror. He could feel the cold breath on his skin, a lingering sensation that refused to dissipate. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to reassert control, to rationalize, to breathe. When he opened them, his flashlight beam, still trembling, fell upon the rag doll in the crib. It was no longer slumped against the rail. Its head was now tilted upwards. Its chipped button eyes, once gazing sightlessly at the ceiling, now seemed to be looking directly at him. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile seemed to stretch across its faded cloth face. A choked gasp escaped Elias's throat. He stumbled back, his foot catching on something unseen, sending him sprawling backwards into the hallway. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly, painting chaotic arcs of light and shadow across the walls and ceiling. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, away from the open doorway of the nursery, away from the rag doll and its silent, terrible gaze. He could hear his own frantic gasps, loud and ragged in the suddenly absolute silence of the upper floor. The tapping had ceased, the whispering had ceased, but the terror remained, a suffocating weight. His eyes darted wildly, trying to regain his bearings in the spinning darkness. The hallway, which had seemed merely long and dark moments before, now felt like a tunnel, stretching endlessly into an abyss. His hand brushed against something cold and smooth on the floor. It was his portable field recorder. He fumbled for it, his fingers slick with sweat. He needed to hear what it had captured. He needed proof. He brought it to his ear, pressing play with a trembling thumb. The recorded silence of the nursery filled his head, punctuated by his own ragged breathing, the distant groans of the house, and the faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap of the block. He listened, straining. Then, just as the tapping ceased on the recording, a new sound emerged, faint, almost drowned out by the static hiss of the recording, but undeniably there. A child's giggle. High-pitched, silvery, and utterly devoid of joy. It was a sound that seemed to curl around the edges of his sanity, thin and brittle, yet resonant with an ancient, unbearable sorrow. And it wasn't coming from the recording. It was coming from the darkness ahead, further down the hallway, from a direction where no door was ajar, where no light could penetrate. It was closer now, impossibly closer, seeming to drift from the very air around him. The distinct, rhythmic sound of small bare feet padding softly on dusty floorboards began to approach from the impenetrable blackness ahead. Each soft thump, thump, thump was a direct assault on his remaining composure, growing steadily louder, drawing closer, not running, but walking with a deliberate, haunting pace. Elias froze, paralyzed by a terror so profound it stole his breath, his voice, his very will to move. He could feel the vibrations through the floor beneath his hands. The sound was not coming from a single point, but seemed to emanate from the entire length of the hallway, a slow, inexorable advance. The air around him dropped to an impossible frigid temperature, and a faint, sweet, metallic scent like old blood and roses filled his nostrils. He squeezed his eyes shut again, desperately trying to block out the encroaching reality, but the sound of the padding footsteps now directly in front of him would not be silenced. He could feel a presence, a cold, heavy weight settling near him, and the faint, breathy whisper was back, right beside his ear, this time clearer, almost forming words. "You've come to listen, haven't you?" The whisper, a breathy current of frigid air directly against Elias's ear, coiled around his spine, freezing him in place. "You've come to listen, haven't you?" The words, though soft, were not merely heard, they were felt, vibrating through the very bones of his skull, resonating with a childlike innocence that was utterly, profoundly malignant. It was the giggle, that high-pitched, brittle sound that echoed the very instant the words died on the air, a sound utterly devoid of joy, like a broken music box playing a morbid lullaby. He lay sprawled in the dust, the beam of his forgotten flashlight still painting erratic patterns on the walls, illuminating fleeting fragments of the peeling wallpaper, the shadowy portraits, the dark, unseeing doors. His portable recorder, clutched in his hand, seemed to hum with the immense, unseen energy of the presence that now enveloped him. The padding footsteps, those soft, deliberate thump, 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 continued. They were no longer advancing from the distance. They were circling him, slow and measured, a silent, predatory dance in the oppressive darkness. A cold, so intense it burned, seeped into his skin, raising gooseflesh across every inch of his body. It was a cold that spoke not of temperature, but of an absence of life, a void. And with it, that sickeningly sweet metallic scent, like old blood mingled with faded roses, thickened in the air, cloying and suffocating. He squeezed his eyes shut again, not in an attempt to block out sight, for there was nothing to see but shadow and dust, but to block out the overwhelming sensory assault. He tried to breathe, but his lungs felt constricted, as if the very air had been drawn out of the room. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate drum solo against the insidious symphony of the house. He felt it then, a feather-light touch, cold as grave dust, brush against his cheek. It lingered, a gossamer caress that made his skin crawl, every nerve ending screaming in protest. He choked back a whimper, refusing to give voice to the terror that threatened to consume him. He was a man of sound, a meticulous observer, and even in this moment of abject horror, a sliver of his analytical mind fought for purchase, desperate to catalog, to understand, to rationalize. But there was no rationalization for this. The padding footsteps paused directly behind him. The air grew impossibly colder. He could feel the weight of an unseen gaze on his back, a pressure that was almost physical. Then the whisper returned, this time not in his ear, but seemingly emanating from the very fabric of the air around him, a multiplicity of faint, breathy voices weaving together like a broken chorus. He doesn't want to listen, not really. He only wants to record. He doesn't understand. The voices were indistinguishable, overlapping, yet each carried that same chilling, childlike inflection. They were not angry, not malevolent in an overt way, but possessed a profound, unsettling sadness, laced with something sharper, something knowing. A sudden, sharp crack ripped through the silence, just inches from his head. He flinched violently, his body recoiling. His flashlight, still clattering, spun to illuminate the space where he had been moments before. A large chunk of plaster, dislodged from the ceiling directly above him, lay shattered on the floor, amidst a fresh flurry of dust. It was as if something had struck the ceiling from above, just to make its presence felt. The message was clear. He was not merely an observer, he was a participant. A jolt of pure, survival-driven adrenaline surged through Elias. He had to move, he had to get out. He scrambled backward, his hands desperately searching for purchase on the dusty floor, pushing himself away from the unseen presence. His flailing arm knocked against his dropped flashlight, sending it skittering further down the hallway, its beam now pointing away from him, leaving him in near total darkness, illuminated only by the faint green lights of his recorder. The soft, padding footsteps resumed, keeping pace with his terrified retreat, always just behind him, always just out of sight. The whispers, too, continued, a relentless, undulating tide of sound that ebbed and flowed with his movements. Don't go. Stay and play. Listen to our song. He pushed himself to his feet, a desperate, clumsy effort. His legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive, but the primal urge to flee propelled him forward. He stumbled down the dark hallway, his arms outstretched, feeling his way along the cold, peeling wallpaper. The walls themselves seemed to press in, the shadows growing denser, twisting into monstrous shapes that writhed at the periphery of his vision. He reached the top of the grand staircase, its dark maw yawning beneath him. The descent was a nightmare. Each ancient step groaned beneath his weight, a deep, resonant protest that amplified his terror. The banister, cold and slick, offered a precarious grip. He could hear the whispers still, drifting up from the bottom of the stairs and down from the top, surrounding him, a disembodied chorus echoing in the vast, empty space. He's running. He doesn't like our game. Such a shame. A sudden violent gust of wind, impossible indoors, swept up the staircase, billowing his jacket, rustling the tattered wallpaper, and rattling the distant, unseen windows. It carried with it a new sound, faint at first, then growing clearer. The distant, mournful strains of a child's lullaby, sung off-key by a voice that was both impossibly young and impossibly old. It was a sound that twisted the very notion of comfort into something profoundly unsettling, a melody of sorrow and lingering despair. He practically fell the last few steps, landing hard on the ground floor, his knees screaming in protest. He didn't pause. He scrambled through the entrance hall, past the shrouded parlor, past the dining room with its overturned chair, heading instinctively for the library, for the equipment, for the one place he had attempted to impose order on this chaos. He needed to turn on all the lights, to banish the oppressive darkness, to make sense of the sounds. He burst into the library, fumbling desperately for the light switch. His hand slammed against the cold wall, searching. There was no switch. The house was too old, its electrical system long defunct. He had meant to bring a lantern, but in his haste and terror, he had forgotten it. Only the faint green glow of his field recorder provided any illumination. He snatched up his primary recording station, his fingers clumsy on the controls. He needed to hear what had been captured, to verify the sounds, to prove he wasn't losing his mind. He pulled on his headphones, adjusting the volume, plunging himself back into the amplified sonic world of Blackwood Mire. The hum of his equipment filled his ears, then the sounds of his own heavy breathing, the distant groans of the house. He scrolled back, searching for the moment he had entered the nursery, for the tapping. There it was, the steady, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Then his whispered description, then the silence, and then, faintly at first, the child's giggle. It sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. But then the recording continued, showing him something he hadn't perceived in the moment of terror. After his stumble, after the clatter of his flashlight, the recording captured the whispers, the padding footsteps, his own ragged gasps. And then, as he scrambled backward, the sound of something else dragging across the wooden floorboards, a slow, heavy scraping, as if a large, heavy object was being moved from the nursery and into the hallway. He listened again, his blood turning to ice. The dragging sound was distinct, laborious, accompanied by faint, strained creaks that were not the house settling, but the sound of wood on wood, of a heavy weight being shifted. It seemed to move with a purpose, away from the nursery, and then, impossibly, down the stairs. His breath hitched. He ripped off the headphones, the sudden return to the less amplified sounds of the library jarring. He strained his ears. And he heard it, faint from the ground floor, but undeniably present. The distinct, slow, heavy scrape, creak, scrape of something being dragged across the floorboards, moving towards the front of the house, towards the main entrance. And accompanying it, a low, guttural murmur, too deep to be a child's voice, too rhythmic to be merely a house settling. It was a sound that vibrated through the floor beneath his feet, a low, resonant groan that felt like the earth itself was exhaling. He grabbed his tactical flashlight, its beam still lying forgotten where it had fallen, and spun towards the library door. The hallway stretched into darkness, leading to the entrance. He had to see, he had to know what was being dragged. He crept out of the library, his heart thundering. The scraping sound was louder now, closer, originating from the main hall. He crept along the wall, flashlight held high, his beam cutting through the gloom. The grand entrance hall was a swirling vortex of shadow and profound, unnatural cold. The air shimmered, thick with that cloying, metallic sweetness. The scraping sound had stopped. He swept his flashlight across the expanse. The heavy oak front door, which he had closed and locked upon entering, now stood slightly ajar. a sliver of inky blackness revealing the desolate night outside. And there, in the center of the hall, directly beneath the soaring dark ceiling, was the grand, intricately carved crib from the nursery. It stood upright, somehow transported from the upper floor, sitting silently on the dusty floorboards. But it was no longer empty. Inside the crib, nestled amongst a tangle of faded, mud-stained blankets, was the rag doll. Its button eyes, chipped and ancient, gazed directly at Elias. And beside it, partially obscured by the blankets, was another doll. This one was larger, older, its porcelain face cracked and stained, one eye missing, its blonde yarn hair matted and tangled. It was clutching a small, tarnished silver locket in one jointed hand. And then, from the depths of the crib, from the shadows beneath the dolls, a new sound emerged. Not a whisper, not a giggle, but a low, sustained hum, a deep vibration that resonated through the floor, through his very bones. It was a sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, a guttural, ancient resonance. And slowly, impossibly, the rocking horse from the nursery, which he had seen earlier, lying tilted and still, began to rock gently back and forth in the vast empty hall, its hollow wooden body creaking softly. The sound of its movement was accompanied by the faint rhythmic tap, tap, tap from the floor above, a sound that was now no longer coming from a single alphabet block, but from multiple unseen objects dancing in the darkness of the nursery. Elias backed away slowly, his mind reeling. The crib, the dolls, the rocking horse, they were not just objects. They were vessels. The house was not merely haunted by one entity, but by a chorus of them, an entire spectral family. And they had not merely watched him, they had moved, they had acted, they had listened to his terror. He could feel a new presence now, immense and cold, not just from the crib, but from the very stones of the house, rising around him like a suffocating tide. The low hum from the crib deepened, growing into a resonant thrum, a sound that felt like a pulse, a heartbeat. And from the darkness above, from the second floor, a collective, drawn-out sigh descended, like 100 unseen breaths exhaled, chilling him to the core. He could hear them now, not just from the recorder, but in the very air, the faint, childlike whispers, no longer teasing, but insistent, surrounding him. Now you belong to us. Part 4. The words, "Now you belong to us," were not spoken, but resonated, a collective thought pressed directly into Elias Thorne's mind, a suffocating weight that crushed the air from his lungs. The low hum from the crib pulsed, growing in intensity, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very foundations of the Mire house, through the ancient stone and into Elias's bones. It felt like the house itself was breathing, a slow, monstrous inhalation. He stumbled backward, away from the crib and its silent, unblinking occupants, away from the impossible tableau in the entrance hall. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and analytical thought, was unraveling at the seams. The carefully constructed walls of his sanity were crumbling under the relentless assault of the impossible. Dolls moved, whispers materialized, objects defied gravity and distance. There was no rational explanation, no scientific principle that could encompass the malevolent sentience that now surrounded him. The humming from the crib intensified, becoming a low, guttural chant that seemed to rise from the very earth, accompanied by the eerie creak of the rocking horse swaying rhythmically in the shadows. From above, from the second floor, the faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap resumed. No longer a solitary sound, but a cascade of taps, like countless tiny objects dancing on the floorboards, a spectral rain of sound. Elias pressed himself against the cold, damp wall of the entrance hall, his tactical flashlight beam trembling wildly, illuminating grotesque caricatures in the peeling wallpaper. His breath hitched in his throat, a frantic, shallow gasp. He had to escape. He had to break free from this horrifying sonic trap. He lunged for the front door, the sliver of inky blackness beyond it offering the faintest glimmer of hope. His fingers scrabbled at the heavy oak, searching for the lock, for the release. But the door, which had been ajar only moments before, was now stubbornly, impossibly shut. He pushed, pulled, hammered against the thick wood, but it remained unyielding, as if sealed by an unseen, insurmountable force. The faint, high-pitched giggle echoed from the darkness around him, light and mocking. He spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the hall. The crib, with its silent, watchful dolls, still pulsed with that unholy hum. The rocking horse continued its spectral rhythm. The tapping from upstairs grew louder, more frantic, a flurry of tiny, insistent impacts. The whispers were everywhere now, a cacophony of soft, childlike voices, indistinguishable yet unified, swirling around him like a freezing mist. "You can't leave. We just want to play. Forever and ever." His eyes darted wildly, seeking an alternative exit. The parlor, the dining room, the library, each door a dark, uninviting maw into deeper shadows. But then he remembered the back of the house, the kitchen, perhaps a back door, a window. It was a desperate hope, a fleeting thought born of pure terror. He bolted, abandoning his equipment, abandoning everything but the desperate, primal urge for survival. He sprinted through the hallway, past the dining room, the overturned chair seeming to mock him with its disarray. He could hear the padding footsteps now, not just behind him, but from every direction, a chorus of soft thumps echoing his own frantic flight, closing in. He burst into the kitchen, a cavernous, dilapidated space that smelled of stale air, mildew, and something metallic, like ancient rust. The moonlight, thin and watery, filtered through a grimy window, casting long, spectral shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. A colossal cast-iron stove, black and grim, dominated one wall, its cold presence radiating an unnatural chill. He spotted it, a heavy wooden back door, warped and splintered, leading out into what he hoped was the back garden. He threw himself against it, his shoulder aching from the impact. The door shrieked in protest, but held fast. He slammed against it again and again, grunting with exertion, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Each impact sent a fresh shiver through the house, eliciting a renewed chorus of whispers and giggles from the surrounding shadows. "Don't try. It's no use. You're ours now." He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his ankle, as if something had brushed against it, cold and prickly. He cried out, stumbling, his hand flying down to touch the throbbing spot. There was nothing there, but the sensation of 1,000 tiny needles persisted, a phantom pain that dug deep. He turned, his flashlight beam cutting a desperate swath through the kitchen's gloom, and then he saw it. Standing in the doorway, framed by the shadows of the main house, was a figure. It was small, no taller than a child, but its silhouette was wrong, distorted, too thin, too elongated. It was dressed in what appeared to be a faded, old-fashioned dress, its fabric hanging in tatters. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and from the darkness where its face should have been, 2 pinpricks of light, red and malevolent, glowed with an unsettling intensity. It was the rag doll from the crib, but impossibly, horrifyingly, it was standing, animate, its button eyes burning with an ancient, silent malice. And clutched in its tiny cloth hand was a tarnished silver locket, the same one he had seen with the larger doll in the crib. A cold, visceral terror seized Elias. This was beyond sound, beyond observation. This was a physical manifestation, a nightmare made flesh and fabric. He could hear the frantic drumming of his own heart, a desperate tattoo against the deafening silence that had fallen over the kitchen. The whispers had ceased. The giggling had ceased. Only the low, guttural hum from the crib in the entrance hall resonated through the floorboards, a steady, pulsing thrum that felt like a countdown. The rag doll took a step forward, its movement jerky, unnatural, a grotesque mimicry of a child's walk. Each soft thump, thump, thump of its cloth feet on the linoleum floor was a hammer blow to Elias's already shattered composure. The air in the kitchen grew impossibly frigid, and the cloying scent of old blood and roses intensified, making him gag. He backed away, pressing himself against the cold, grimy wall, his flashlight beam fixed on the approaching abomination. The red pinpricks of its eyes seemed to grow brighter, drawing him in, ensnaring him in their malevolent gaze. He could feel its presence, a palpable wave of ancient malice washing over him. It stopped a few feet away, its head still tilted, its form unnervingly still. And then, slowly, impossibly, a faint, breathy sound emanated from it. Not a whisper, not a giggle, but a low, guttural groan, deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the house. It was the hum, amplified, given a voice, a sound of profound, ancient suffering and rage. And then it opened its mouth. No, not a mouth, not a seam in the fabric, but a gaping, black void appeared where its stitched smile should have been. It was not merely an opening, it was an abyss, a swirling vortex of absolute darkness that seemed to suck the light and air from the room. And from within that darkness, a single agonizing scream tore forth. It was not a child's scream, it was the scream of an adult, full of unspeakable agony and despair, a sound so raw, so potent, that it ripped through Elias's ears, vibrating through his skull, shaking him to his very core. It was a scream that spoke of betrayal, of prolonged torture, of the ultimate surrender to an unbearable fate. It was a sound that had been held for centuries, now unleashed with devastating force. Elias clapped his hands over his ears, dropping his flashlight, which rolled away into a dark corner, plunging the kitchen into near total blackness. The scream continued, relentless, deafening, tearing at his sanity. He sank to his knees, his body racked with tremors, his mind spiraling into a vortex of pure, unadulterated terror. He could feel the presence of the rag doll before him, even in the darkness, the impossible cold, the cloying scent. The scream seemed to emanate not just from the doll, but from the entire house, from the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was the voice of Blackwood Mire itself, a voice of ancient, unbearable pain. And then, as abruptly as it began, the scream ceased. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, it was a vacuum, a suffocating void that pressed in on him, heavier, more profound than anything he had experienced before. The air was thick, heavy, almost viscous. The cold intensified, a glacial grip that tightened around his heart. He slowly lowered his hands from his ears, his body aching, his mind reeling. The kitchen was dark, utterly silent. He strained his eyes, trying to discern any shape, any movement. Nothing. The rag doll was gone. He was alone. Or so he thought. A new sound, faint but clear, reached his ears from the darkness of the kitchen. It was the soft, rhythmic clink, clink, clink of metal on metal. He recognized it instantly. It was the sound of the tarnished silver locket being gently opened and closed. It was coming from very close by, directly in front of him, at eye level. He slowly, agonizingly slowly, raised his head. In the absolute darkness, 2 pinpricks of red light flared into existence, directly before him, close enough for him to feel the radiating cold. They were the rag doll's button eyes, and as his own eyes adjusted, he could just make out the faint, pale outline of its tiny cloth hand holding the locket open. And from within the locket, a new whisper emerged, clear and distinct, no longer childlike, but imbued with a strange, resonant authority. It was a single name, repeated with a chilling, possessive certainty. Eleanor. The name hung in the air, a spectral echo. And then, from the depths of the locket, from the very core of the darkness, a tiny withered finger, impossibly skeletal, emerged, pointing directly at Elias. The red eyes of the rag doll intensified, blazing with a silent, terrible understanding. He was no longer just a listener. He was the next chapter in Blackwood Meyer's endless, agonizing story. The name, Eleanor, echoed in the suffocating darkness of the kitchen, not merely a sound, but a cold, heavy truth pressed directly into Elias Thorne's consciousness. It resonated with an ancient familiarity, a name he felt he should know, a memory trying to surface from the deepest, most forgotten corners of his mind. The withered finger, impossibly skeletal, jutted from the tarnished locket, pointing at him with an accusation that transcended generations. The rag doll's button eyes, glowing with malevolent red pinpricks, held him transfixed. A deep, resonant thrum vibrated up from the floorboards, a slow, relentless pulse that felt like the heart of the house itself, now fully awake, fully aware. The cloying scent of old blood and roses thickened in the air, a nauseating perfume of decay and remembrance. Elias found himself unable to move, unable to breathe, his mind a frantic, desperate scramble of terror and fragmented thoughts. Then, from the abyss of the doll's gaping mouth, not a scream this time, but a voice. It was not the child's whisper, nor the guttural hum, but a clear, melodic, yet utterly desolate tone, imbued with an ancient sorrow. "She brought you here, Elias, your great-aunt, Eleanor." The revelation struck him like a physical blow. Eleanor, his great-aunt, the woman who had bequeathed him this nightmare. The name unlocked a flood of suppressed memories, hushed family conversations, the morbid fascination with the ancestral home, the sudden, almost eager way his great-aunt's solicitor had handled the transfer, almost as if he were unburdening himself of a curse. He remembered his great-aunt Eleanor in fleeting glimpses, a gaunt woman, always dressed in black, her eyes possessing a distant, haunted quality, her infrequent letters filled with cryptic remarks about listening and the deep quiet. "She knew," the doll's voice continued, a chilling lament. "She always knew. She tried to listen, like you, but she was weak. She couldn't hear us all." The withered finger retreated into the locket, which snapped shut with a faint metallic clink. The doll's red eyes remained fixed on him, burning with an unholy intensity. Suddenly, the kitchen exploded with sound. The colossal cast-iron stove began to groan and clang, its heavy metal panels echoing with a hollow, booming resonance. From the grimy windows, a chorus of faint, childlike whimpers and sobs rose, as if dozens of unseen children were pressed against the panes, their ghostly breath clouding the glass. The creaking of the rocking horse from the distant entrance hall intensified, becoming a frantic, rhythmic gallop, accompanied by the ceaseless, frantic tap, tap, tap from the floor above, now a deafening, percussive symphony of tiny, unseen impacts. Elias stumbled backward, his hands flying to his ears, desperate to block out the overwhelming sonic assault. The cold intensified, a wave of glacial air that stole his breath, leaving him gasping. The kitchen seemed to stretch, the walls receding into impossible distances, the shadows twisting into grasping forms that writhed at the periphery of his vision. He was no longer in a room, he was in a maelstrom of sound and shadow, a prisoner within the very essence of the Mire House. "We need a listener," the doll's voice resonated through the chaos, clear and distinct. "Someone strong, someone who understands the whispers, someone to set us free, or to join our song." A desperate, primal surge of adrenaline coursed through Elias. He had to escape. This was not a haunting, it was a hungry, sentient entity, and he was its prey. He turned, blindly searching for an exit, any exit. The back door, previously impenetrable, seemed to waver, its warped wood shimmering in the gloom. He threw himself against it, not with logic, but with the raw, animalistic force of terror. This time, the door shrieked open, not with a creak, but with a sound like tearing flesh, revealing the moonless, inky blackness of the mire beyond. The air outside was damp and cold, heavy with the scent of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. He scrambled through the opening, falling onto the treacherous, uneven ground. The back garden was a swamp, a treacherous expanse of black, glistening mud and gnarled, skeletal trees whose branches clawed at the night sky. The ground beneath him was slick, treacherous, sucking at his boots with a greedy, insistent pull. He struggled to his feet, slipping, his hands sinking into the cold, viscous mud. From behind him, the kitchen door slammed shut with a thunderous crack, the sound echoing across the desolate mire. The chorus of whispers, giggles, and frantic tapping seemed to follow him, emanating from the very air, surrounding him in the desolate expanse. He forced himself forward, his legs churning through the clinging mud, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The Mire House loomed behind him, a black, jagged silhouette against the oppressive night sky, its windows now all glowing with a faint internal light, like 100 malevolent eyes watching his futile escape. The mud grew deeper, sucking at his boots with increasing force. He could feel it dragging him down, slowly, inexorably. The skeletal trees, draped with strands of Spanish moss that looked like ghostly hair, seemed to lean in, their branches twisting into grotesque, grasping hands. The silence of the mire was not comforting. It was a deceptive shroud, masking a deeper, more insidious horror. He heard it then, a sound that froze his blood, a soft, rhythmic thump, 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 coming from the mire itself, just ahead of him, just out of sight in the deeper shadows. It was the sound of small, bare feet padding on soft earth, or perhaps on something even softer, something yielding. The padding footsteps were not fleeing, they were waiting. A high-pitched giggle, brittle and devoid of joy, drifted from the darkness ahead. He tried to turn back, to escape the unseen presence in the mire, to find a different path, but the mud had him. His left boot was stuck fast, sinking deeper with every frantic tug. He felt a sudden, sharp cold against his calf, then a gentle, insistent pressure, as if something was slowly, deliberately pulling him further down. She always tried to leave. A whisper sighed directly into his ear, impossibly close, yet utterly without origin. But the Mire House, it never lets go. A memory, sharp and agonizing, pierced through the fog of his terror. His great-aunt Eleanor, her last letter to him, tucked inside the will. He had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman, but the words now resonated with a chilling clarity. The house, it feeds on sound, Elias. On silence. It wants to be heard. But once you start listening, it listens back. And then it won't let you stop. Don't go to the mire. Don't let it take you like it took the others, like it took her. Her? Who was her? He pulled frantically, desperately at his stuck boot, his breath coming in ragged sobs. The mud was up to his knees, cold and clinging. He could feel unseen things brushing against his legs, soft and slick. From the depths of the mire, a low, guttural hum began to rise, the same sound that had emanated from the crib, now amplified 1,000-fold, vibrating through the very water and earth around him. The rag doll materialized before him, its red eyes blazing in the darkness, its tattered dress clinging to its tiny, distorted form. It stood on the surface of the mire, defying gravity, utterly still. And slowly, agonizingly, it raised its cloth arm, and once again the withered finger emerged from the locket, pointing not at him, but at something just behind him, something in the water. He turned his head slowly, his heart a frozen lump in his chest. The moonlight, breaking through a fleeting gap in the clouds, illuminated a patch of water just behind him. And there, partially submerged in the black, oily water, was a small wooden rocking horse, its painted eyes faded and chipped, its ancient yarn mane matted and decaying. It was the same rocking horse from the nursery, now out in the mire, gently bobbing on the surface. But it was not empty. Clutched tightly in the rocking horse's saddle, its tiny skeletal hand still gripping the wooden handle, was a child's skeleton. Small, fragile bones picked clean by time and the mire, its skull tilted upward, its empty eye sockets gazing at the churning clouds. And around its neck, tangled in the few remaining strands of what looked like faded blonde hair, was a tarnished silver locket. The whisper returned, clear and distinct, no longer from the doll, but from the skeletal remains, from the mire itself. "Eleanor, my little Eleanor." Elias gasped, a choked guttural sound. The child in the rocking horse, the locket, his great-aunt Eleanor, the survivor, the one who left the house to him. She had abandoned her family, left them to the mire, but the Mire House had never forgotten. And now it had called a descendant back. It had called him. The mud had him completely now. He was sinking, slowly, inexorably, the cold, viscous embrace pulling him deeper. He could feel the water rising around his chest, his neck. The rag doll, Eleanor's doll, stood motionless, its red eyes burning. The spectral rocking horse, with its skeletal rider, bobbed gently, its creaking a mournful lullaby. The whispers intensified, not just around him, but within him, filling his mind, merging with his own frantic thoughts, twisting them, distorting them. He could hear all of them now, the sobs, the giggles, the frantic tapping, the deep guttural hum of the house, the mournful creak of the rocking horse. He was hearing it all, every sound, every echo, every scream that had ever been uttered within the Mire House and its encompassing swamp. He was the perfect listener. His portable field recorder, still clutched in his hand, was now submerged in the black water. He pressed record, a final, desperate, unconscious act. The green light pulsed, a silent testament to the recording process, capturing the gurgling sounds of the mire, the overwhelming chorus of spectral voices, and his own final, desperate, silent screams as the cold water closed over his head. The last thing Elias Thorne perceived as the darkness of the mire enveloped him was a profound, chilling silence. But it was not an absence of sound. It was the silence of 100 voices, all listening, all waiting. And then, from that profound silence, a single, new sound emerged, recorded by his submerged device. A low, resonant hum, slowly, chillingly transforming into a new voice, a new whisper, joining the eternal chorus of the Mire house. It was Elias's voice, and it was no longer his own.